Okay, here we go with values part 2. In the last class we discussed what are values, in particular what are your individual values. In this class we're going to be looking at other people's values and how they interact with your values. We'll begin with a story about Darius the Great, the king of Persia from 2,500 years ago. Then we'll check out some philosophy discussions, ESPN style. We'll dip into what is postmodernism, and then we will really get into the idea of our values relative, and we'll have lots of samples and examples and a survey. So this question of are values relative to an individual culture, or are there any universal values that connect all people, is not a small or purely academic question or issue. It's literally about the survival of the species, or at least some semblance of having a life that's worth living. There's 7 billion people on the planet, and survival depends on all these people being able to cooperate and work together. And people cooperate through the power of ideas, right? There's only 2 ways to actually work out a problem with another person. You either talk about it, you talk about the ideas, and you have a discussion, or you fight and kill. Fighting and kill is actually really effective because you just eradicate the problem, but it is less than ideal and creates all sorts of other problems. So really, all we have is talking about ideas. But then we get back to the elephant and we realize this thing we're talking about is so huge that it's impossible for everybody to have the exact same perspective. The problem is there's so many values that people can have, and different cultures have radically different interpretations of what it means to live a worthwhile life. So while we're all living on the same planet, the same globe, mentally and emotionally, we're living in different universes. And if we are going to agree on some specific values, then what are those values? The real question here is there right and wrong when we're discussing human behavior, or are all values relative because each culture does things differently, and who are we to judge a different culture? Another way of phrasing this question is, when is a belief system not only false, but so destructive that we should be able to condemn it? And on the flip side, when is it culturally imperialistic and philosophically naive to say, well, we do it this way, they should do it that way too? So before we get into it, let me just do a quick review of what we talked about in the last class. We were defining value, and we discussed the difference between economic value and emotional value. Economic value is the regard that something is held to deserve, the importance, worth, or usefulness of something. So, for instance, gold is just a rock, but we've all decided that this is a very special rock and it is more valuable than other rocks. People will kill each other for this rock. They can't eat it. They can't even really use it for anything except maybe a paperweight. So economic value is represented by the maximum amount a consumer is willing to pay for an item in a free market economy. Then we have emotional values, which are a person's principles or standards of behavior, one's judgment of what is important in life. So an emotional value is a person's principles or standards of behavior. And when you look at the definitions of both economic and emotional values, they have the same word, important. Values are what are important to us. As Julie Jansen said, values are what motivate and fulfill you. They imbue your work and your life with meaning. In essence, a value is what is important to you. The question is, what are the values that 7 billion people can agree on so we can safely function as a civilization and a species? And this is a specifically important question right now, but humans have been asking and struggling with this exact same question for thousands of years. So I'm going to give you 2 examples right now of this debate. One was from 500 BC and one was from 2014, which was 6 years ago. So let's start with Darius the Great. He was the king of Persia in around 550 BC, and he had this incredible empire that stretched all the way from India all the way to Greece and North Africa. And Darius would travel all throughout his empire, and he observed different cultural traits and behaviors in different parts of his empire. So one day, to investigate this idea, he called over the Greeks and the Galatians to his palace in what is now modern-day Iran. And the Galatians were a tribe in India, and as we know, the Greeks were a tribe in the Mediterranean. The Greeks had a custom of when their father dies, they build a pyre, which is like a big piece of wood. They put their father on it, and they set their father on fire and cremate the ashes. The Galatians in India did something different. They would actually eat their father. They would eat the dead body of their father. Which actually kind of makes sense, because you came out of your father, so it would make sense for your father to go back inside of you, especially if you wanted some of his traits or personality behaviors. That actually makes sense. But what Darius did was he called the Greeks over and he called the Galatians over into his palace, and he said to the Greeks, "What would it take for you to eat your dead father?" And the Greeks said, "Are you crazy? What are you talking about? Eating our fathers? This is, oh my God, what are you talking about?" And the Galatians then, he said to them, "What would it take for you to set your dead father on fire?" "Oh my God, don't speak of such things. How could you talk about setting the father on fire? That's repulsive." And so what Darius realized 2,500 years ago is that people had very different ways of approaching the exact same universal phenomenon, which is the death of their father. Both of them were 100% certain that their way was the normal way and that anything else was a horrible deviance. Now let's fast forward 2,500 years to cable television and sports. This is a guy named Adrian Peterson. He's a running back. Back then he played for the Minnesota Vikings. He's on another team now. And he got in big trouble because he has something like 5 kids. And one of his kids, he wound up whipping so badly that the kid they called the police and he got arrested. And I think he got suspended for the season or something like that. But this was a big deal because it triggered this conversation. What's the boundaries between disciplining your child and abusing your child? So they had this debate on ESPN where they were getting into a deep philosophical discussion without realizing the context or even the history of what they're talking about.
What about the other? Can you hit a child?
I'm from the South. I understand boomers' rage and anger, but I think, listen, we have to accept we were born in. He's a white guy, I'm a black guy. I don't know where he's from. I'm from the South. Whipping is, we do that all the time. Every black parent in the South is gonna be in jail under those circumstances. I think we have to be careful letting people they dictate how they, treat their
Chuck,
children.
doesn't matter where you're from. Right is right and wrong is wrong. Doesn't matter where you're from.
I don't believe that because, listen, we spank kids in the South. I think the question about did Adrian Peterson go overboard? But listen, Jim, we all grew up in different environments. Listen, every black parent in my neighborhood in the South would be in trouble or in jail under those circumstances.
Listen, my thing is, I don't want to tell anybody how to raise their kids, and I really don't want anybody telling me how to raise my kids. But let's make a distinction between child rearing and child abuse.
And that's
that was child abuse. There's no fine line here.
I think there's a fine line. Jim, I've had many welts on my legs in last week.
Welts like that?
Yes.
Had?
Oh, yeah. I've got beat with switches. And I hate to use, first of all, I don't even like the term. When the media talks about it and somebody just said something on television, beating a child. Listen, we don't.
But that's what that was, though, Chuck. I mean, you saw the pictures.
Well, we call it spanking, or we call it spanking or whipping our kids.
If I see open wounds and bruises throughout a body, that is a beating.
Sure, I think those pictures are disturbing. Maybe I think Adrian said he went overboard. But as far as being from the South, we all spanked our kids. I got spanked, me and my 2 brothers.
But then, Chuck, not now, right? I mean, that 1964 is one thing, 2014 is another.
And that's
Maybe
fair.
we need to rethink this thing.
And I totally agree with that. Maybe we need to rethink. think it, but I think we have to really be careful trying to teach other parents how to discipline their kids. That's a very fine line.
All right, so some disagreement here. JB?
You see, they're talking about the exact same thing we're talking about here. Is there right and wrong in this world, or is everything up to interpretation based on a person's own personal experience or their culture's experience?
Chuck, doesn't matter where you're from. Right is right and wrong is wrong. Doesn't matter where you're from.
I don't believe that.
So right now, we're going to start the survey. If you go to Canvas, there is a link there that says Cultural Relativism Survey. Click on it. You will see 10 different questions, and you can anonymously say if you think that there's right or wrong, or if everything's culturally relative, right? RW is right and wrong, CR culturally relative. So right now I want you to go to question number 1, and don't connect it to this ESPN debate about the football player and his kid. Just think broadly on an abstract level, intuitively, and just write down your answer quickly. I don't want you to ponder it. I just want you to instinctively tell me what you think. That is there right and wrong in the world, or is everything relative to the way you were raised and what your culture believes? Okay, now I would like to talk about postmodernism. Postmodernism is a term that means a lot of things to a lot of people, so it's kind of confusing. But also, if we understand it a little bit, it adds a lot of clarity and focus to this conversation we're having today. So to understand postmodernism, it's important to understand the concepts of modernism and pre-modernism and how these 3 different eras all fit together. So pre-modernism is from the earliest days of prehistory, from when we crawled out of the cave to about 1700. From 1700 to about the beginning of the 20th century is what in Europe they called the Age of Reason, or the Age of Enlightenment, and that was really the foundation of the modern world as we know it. And then after 1915, after World War I, started emerging a new way of looking at the world called postmodernism. So as far as pre-modernism, it's important to remember that the agricultural revolution happened about 10,000 years ago. That's when people stopped just being like hunter and gatherers and started raising food and kind of controlling their destiny. And that was 10,000 years ago, so that's about 500 generations. Before that, human beings were around for 50,000 generations. Right? 50,000 generations, then the agricultural revolution, and then we've only been 500 generations since then. So those 50,000 generations, it's important that that's where our psyche developed, and that when we were part of the natural world, that's when you have things like mysticism and faith being the way people really interacted with the world. There was ritual and myth, dogma, curses, shamanism, revelation. You know, a common way of healing people throughout many places in the world was to sacrifice an animal and slice its stomach open, pull out its intestines, and read into the future by reading the stomach intestines. So that's how the pre-modern world functioned. That was the logical realm they lived in. Then, with the beginning of the Age of Reason, a new idea of objectivism came in, that is, experience and reason. We can observe things through empirical testing and debate and being skeptical. This was the birth of science and the birth of humanism, that is, that human beings intrinsically are important and we don't need a supernatural being to sprinkle dust on us to say we're important. And progress, that if we live by these principles of open debate and empirical testing, we will be able to make each generation better and better and better. Then what happened was in 1914, World War I broke out in Europe. And it was France and England and Russia against Germany and Austria. But this was the most horrific war the world had ever seen. And maybe to this day is the most horrific war. All of a sudden, for the first time ever, there was machine guns and tanks and poisonous gas, and even something as simple as barbed wire. None of these things existed. They were all inventions from science. So 50 years ago, none of them existed. War before then was more horses and knives. I mean swords. But now it took on a whole new level of torment and terror. And the way most of the fighting was done on the front line was by digging trenches. And people would live, the soldiers would live in those trenches for months at a time, because the war had just become this brutal stalemate. And the second you walk out of the trench, you're toast. Look at these battles from World War I. 1.8 million people dying in one offensive. The Battle of Somme in Belgium was 1.2 million people died in one battle. Okay, not in a war, in one battle in a war that lasted 4 years. What happened then was, after people experienced World War I, they said, wait a minute, we thought this age of reason and all of these machines and science, this was what happened to human progress. We just sunk into the ultimate hell. So people became very skeptical of everything. All of a sudden there was this idea of, well, if everything that we thought isn't true, then what is true? And how do I know it's true? It's not a discussion of what is the ultimate truth. It's, does ultimate truth even exist? And few of us realize that even to hold the concept of relative truth makes us entirely different from people who lived only a few decades ago, let alone 99% of human history. As I said, postmodernism means a lot of things to a lot of people. Anthropologists have postmodern theories, artists and philosophers have postmodern theories, but if there's three elements to it that I think are applicable to all the different ideas of postmodernism, it's these. One, there's an unregulated marketplace of belief. And this is from the reading you did from the book called Reality Isn't What It Used to Be. Unregulated marketplace of beliefs, which means in the postmodern world, we're all required to make choices about our reality. The only choice we don't have is not making a choice. You see, it used to be, you're a potato farmer, your father's a potato farmer, your kids are going to be a potato farmer. There wasn't even the ability to have a concept that you could do something outside of what you were born to do. So there were no choices, but now we have nothing but choices. I mean, the internet is one gigantic choice machine. And we can see this very clearly in The Ethical Slut, which is the other reading you did for this class. They said our best definition is that sex is whatever people engaging in it think it is. The chapter contains some of our beliefs. You can have beliefs of your own. What matters to us is not that you agree with us, but that you question the prevailing paradigm and decide for yourself what you believe. You see, this is very postmodern. Not, these are the rules, they've always been that way, you need to follow them. Just kind of like Becca and her Amish family. But no, you can decide what it is. You don't need anyone to tell you. Now, the problem with that is it's very liberating, but it's a burden that few people can actually handle. Most people don't want to be original thinkers because they're terrified. And it's complicated. It's easier if someone just gives you the rules that you get to follow. Another element of postmodernism is that there's a conflict about the nature of truth. Not to argue what truth is, but to argue that truth exists at all. And the big one is cultural relativism. To compare societies in moral terms is impossible. Different cultures have different moral codes. Therefore, there's no objective truth in morality. Right and wrong are only matters of opinion, and opinions vary from culture to culture. You can only understand and accept a different culture on its own terms. To do otherwise is culturally imperialistic, philosophically naive. So in discussing and debating this idea, it really breaks down into two separate camps. One is the absolutists, also known as the objectivists, and the other is the relativists, also known as the constructivists. And the absolutists, as you would assume, believe there is an absolute truth. They believe that there are truths and principles that are right and wrong, and that these are self-evident and eternal. And the moment that we accept that there's right and wrong answers to human well-being, then we must admit there are some people who are just wrong about morality. That is, just like there's people who live an unhealthy physical life, it's possible to live an unhealthy emotional or mental life. And it's important to be able to know what's healthy, unhealthy, right, and wrong. And maybe their biggest argument against cultural relativism is, if everything is relative, then life is meaningless because you don't have to answer to anybody. You can just do what you want. Nazis can just eradicate whatever group of people they don't like because it's their culture. They get to decide. Or I get to go have sex with whatever unwilling people I want because my culture says I'm superior. So in the absolutist way, right and wrong makes human life functional. Without it, it's a one-way ticket to hell. On the other hand, the relativists or the constructivists say that truth is a human invention and taught through culture, and there's no absolute truth that stands outside of human experience. There's no such thing as universal truth in ethics, and there are only various culture codes and nothing more. So there's no objective standard that can be used to judge one society's code as better than the other, right? There's no way you could step outside of life and find this measuring device that can measure which culture is better than the other. It's just up to our interpretation and our perspective and what we're feeling up on the elephant at that given moment. So this discussion is primary to understanding how human beings are going to function together.
Chuck, doesn't matter where you're from. Right is right and wrong is wrong. Doesn't matter where you're from.
I don't believe that because.
And to dig a little deeper into this, I'd like to play for you 5 minutes of a debate discussion between Russell Brand, who is a comedian, and Sam Harris, who is a neurobiologist and podcast host. And they discuss this exact topic. And the issue that kind of is the trigger for it or brings it up is the burqa, which is a traditional form of dress for women in strict fundamentalist Islamic culture that is not debatable. Women don't get to choose if they want to wear the burqa or not. They're forced to wear the burqa. And what the burqa is basically, it's like a giant drape that just covers you, and you only have eye slits. There's many different types of burqas, but the most extreme ones, you only have eye slits to see. In fact, I was in Egypt once. It was like 110 degrees and I had a heat stroke. It was so hot. And I saw a woman in a burqa that was like made out of velvet. It was thick black cloth and there was no eye slot. See, she was blind and she could only walk down the street holding her man's arm. She was blind. By the way, there is wearing the full burqa, and then there's wearing just a hijab, which is a headscarf. But the basic idea is that modesty is important, and covering the ears and the neck is a proper way to go out and interact with the world. Okay, so let's jump into this conversation. While you're watching it, I want you to see which position you resonate with more. It makes more sense to you. And they start this conversation by talking about what we're talking about in the beginning of class, which is how are you going to get 7 billion people to all be on the same page as far as what's important?
One question is how are we going to get all of these societies that are at
and these 7 billion
loggerheads, people, to see themselves in non-zero-sum arrangements with everyone else, and what will have to change to make that possible? And my concern with religious fundamentalism, and not all religions equally, but my concern is that these are the beliefs that are held most closely. They're the least negotiable. I mean, they're by definition non-negotiable. These are my faith-based beliefs. Are the beliefs that if you challenge them, that will by whatever evidence or whatever argument, I will take that as a personal insult, and I will want to resort immediately to violence or the threat of violence.
Yeah.
I will want blasphemy laws. I will want to pass a law at the UN that will give you jail time if you say the wrong thing about my holy book.
How can you? Because I think you're about to talk about sort of gender issues, but you're once again
It's not
going to
just
use
gender; it's free thought issues. It's science.
Surely, but the metric by which we evaluate them is a distinct metric drawn from another narrative, and we might say, oh bloody hell, women dressing like that or whatever. We can't. I don't think we're in a position to make those kind of decisions.
Of course we are. Of course we are. You don't think you're in a
Why
position?
do you think that their narrative should adhere to our template?
Well, first of all, so you imagine that most women forced to wear a burqa.
I don't know about forced, and my experience
they're
and my
all
conversation
they're all being forced.
has been that it's more that we ought to regard it. But I've asked Muslim women about it, and they said it's like a discipline, and we dig it.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, yeah. But first of all, now I'm talking about a burqa. I'm not talking about someone going to Barnard who elects to wear a headscarf because she likes the way.
So am I.
Linda
looks. I don't
right.
like the imposition of of our heterogeneous, hegemonic ideas of how masculine and feminine relationships work might not be universally applicable.
No, it is.
Sam
No,
Harris.
something is universally applicable, and if it's not universal, we can understand those differences. So if there's a culture where they like spicy food and we don't, but eating spicy food is just another way to be happy as an ape. We can understand those differences biologically and culturally. The idea that it just may be as good a solution for the how to maximize human well-being to put half the population in bags from the moment that and not let them learn to read. I mean, I'm taking Afghanistan. I'm taking the local case of Afghanistan under the Taliban. And it may well fall back. I mean, it's actually Afghanistan currently as well. You're talking about women who have almost the worst possible life on planet Earth. I mean, we're talking about maternal mortality rates that are off the charts. You're talking about illiteracy that you have to go back 200 years
I think this
in the
is
West to find that level of illiteracy.
precisely the kind of reasoning that's used to justify the bombing and commercial colonization of those territories. They're not like us. They treat women different from us. I don't think we're in a position to make those judgments.
Okay, so then tell me how you would react to this. I
systems?
have two daughters, and if I were thinking the way you were thinking about this issue, what if I thought it would be a great idea to have a cultural exchange program where I just sent my daughters over to Afghanistan to live with a Taliban family? So rather than go to summer school here and get prepared to go to an Ivy League college or whatever it is, I send them to live with the Taliban.
You don't need to explain all this to me. I see where you're going.
Okay,
I'm not 9 years old.
No, but
Sam, darling.
Listen,
my point
but you got to
is
answer it.
All of your thought experiments. Well, I'm from a Western culture. I've been indoctrinated differently.
So you're saying there's no right or wrong here,
I don't
really?
think that I'm not in a position. I think it's very different. Me saying I've been born in the West, I've grown up in the West, my daughter's born in the West. Now impose upon her a totally different set of values. I wouldn't want her to go to the deep South either. There's all sorts of things. I wouldn't want her to go to places in Britain.
You don't think it's unlucky to be born a girl in Afghanistan 5 years ago?
I think that these kind of sort of theoretical tableaus are used to create a false hierarchy and a moral superiority by a dominant culture that subsequently uses thinking of this nature to underwrite the modern day colonization and subjugation of these people on a massive scale.
But for you to withhold judgment of the burqa makes absolutely no sense. Again, it comes back to the power of ideas. And I think one of the worst ideas going, really, is the one that you've expressed here, which is, who am I to judge? I'm just a white guy who grew up in the Western context. Who am I to judge the burqa? This kind of moral relativism, postmodernism.
I'm not a postmodernist.
Well, no, but
I'm starting from the perspective of...
I know you don't want to answer that name, but this is the intellectual trend that gave us this kind of apprehension around making these judgments, right? Who am I to say what would be a good life for somebody else?
So now I want you to go back to the survey, and question number 2, you'll see it says Brand versus Harris. And if you agree with Sam Harris that there is right and wrong in the world, circle that one or mark that one. And if you agree with Russell Brand that everything is culturally relative.
So you're saying there's no right or wrong?
I don't think we're in a position to make those judgments.
Okay, so now we're going to get into samples and examples and the survey. This is where the trigger warning really kicks in. If you feel like you've seen enough and you get it, then take the rest of the day off. If you're really into it, then let's proceed. And as we proceed, I want you to have this kind of criteria for contemplating. What is overreach where you are culturally imperialistic and philosophically naive? Okay, what is just not rational or reasonable or functional, or you wouldn't want someone telling you how to be? And at what point do you say that this is so wrong that there's no excuse for this? It doesn't matter how long you've been doing it, it's just horrible and it has to stop.
Chuck, doesn't matter where you're from. Right is right and wrong is wrong. Doesn't matter where you're from.
I don't believe that.
Let's get into it. Number 1, dogs for dinner. So in much of Asia and Southeast Asia, people eat dogs. Just like chickens, cows, pigs, dogs are a legitimate food. In fact, there's dog farms. They also buy dogs from people. Like if you're really broke, just like, all right, sell the dog and get a little extra cash. And they cook them and have, I saw this in Vietnam, they have just giant, just like in New York where you see a guy with a cart selling hot dogs, you have carts just like this where people have all these roasted dogs with giant cleavers and are just serving it up. So here's an article from Reuters. Home of China's dog meat festival defiant amid outcry. Residents of China's southern city of Yulin defended eating dog meat to celebrate the summer solstice on Thursday as animal rights activists seek new ways to pressure organizers to cancel the annual festival. The 10-day event, dubbed the Lychee and Dog Meat Festival by residents, has become a lightning rod for dog lovers who every year confront those who buy, sell, and eat canines. Festival goers remain defiant. Yulin's so-called Lychee and Dog Meat Festival is just a popular custom of ours. Popular customs themselves cannot be right or wrong.
So you're saying there's no right or wrong?
I don't think we're in a position to make those judgments.
Okay, so
and the scenes of a bloody dog slaughter that you see online, I just want to say that killing of any animal is bloody, and I hope people can look at this objectively. Question number 3, is it acceptable to slaughter and eat dogs? Right or wrong, or relative to an individual culture? Next, we have Abu Ghraib. Abu Ghraib was a prison in Iraq. When the U.S. invaded Iraq and took over the country, they took over that prison and made it a U.S. military prison. In, I believe it was 2006 or 2007, photos were leaked of American soldiers torturing Iraqi prisoners in very cruel and sadistic ways. Here are some photos. There's thousands and thousands of photos, and maybe about 50 or 60 were released to the press. So number 4, sadistically torturing captives is permissible. Right or wrong, or culturally relative? Albino hunting. So this is my friend Marjorie. I met her in Holland. She's in the balloon world, and she started going to Tanzania, I think as a safari, but once she was there, she learned about this cultural practice that happens there, and she told me about it. At first I didn't even believe her. She told me a common practice is for people to believe that albinos have magical powers, and that if you eat the albino child, if you cut off his arm and eat his arm, you will get magical powers or it'll heal you. You can't make this up. This is articles from CNN, LA Times, People magazine. In parts of Africa, people with albinism are hunted for their body parts. The latest victim, a 9-year-old boy. Number 5, mutilating and eating children for health reasons is acceptable. Right and wrong, or hey, that's how they do it in their culture. Who am I to judge? And oh, by the way, my friend Margie, who I was telling you about, who went to Africa and told me about this, she moved to Tanzania and dedicated her life to helping these albino kids, and she Met an African dude and they have a couple kids. So this changed her life and she's there full time now. So this article is from CNN. Brunei to punish gay sex and adultery with death by stoning. Now take a moment to think about what death by stoning is. It's super ancient, super primitive, so brutal. You're up against a wall, you're surrounded by people, they all got rocks, and they're just going to start throwing the rocks at you until your head cracks open and you die. It's got to be one of the most painful, slow and painful ways to die. And by the way, look at this article. This article is from March 30th, 2019. Okay, we're not digging into the ancient past. This is like, people are still debating this now. A new law which comes into effect next week will punish homosexual sex and adultery with death in the small Southeast Asian kingdom of Brunei. Beginning on August 3rd, any individual found guilty of the offenses will be stoned to death according to the new penal code. The punishment will be witnessed by a group of Muslims. And by the way, there's 13 countries where being gay is legally punishable by death. So question number 6, homosexuality is unnatural and should be eradicated. Child marriage. So this is in India, and here's an article, child marriage rampant in West Bengal's Malda, but parties believe addressing social evil would be political suicide. Despite the high prevalence of child marriage in West Bengal's Malda district, very few police cases get reported, and the rate of conviction is even more abysmal. The practice of child marriage isn't new to India. The census in 1931 shows that 72% of girls in India were married before the age of 15 at the time. 72%. The article interviewed one young lady named Selena, and she was forced to marry when she was 14. A lot of times the man's family will give money to the young woman's family. It's a kind of reverse dowry, and it's for boys who are considered unsuitable, but look for good-looking girls from economically weaker families. So they lure them with cash and the promise of relative comfort. National Geographic actually did a whole photographic series on this you could check out. India's Forgotten Child Brides. Number 7, is an arranged marriage between a child and a grown man acceptable? Female genital mutilation. Okay, this is a rough one. So in the female anatomy, there's the clitoris. The clitoris only has one job in the world. It doesn't do anything else but be a source of pleasure. It has so many nerve endings in there, and a lot of women are only capable of reaching orgasm when their clitoris is stimulated. Certainly not all, but a lot. And female genital mutilation is literally about carving out the clitoris of a young girl, 5, 6, 7 years old, with a knife or with something hot, like burn it off. So the woman will not want sex when she's older and will be more loyal to her husband. The UN estimates that at least 200 million women and girls today have undergone female genital mutilation in 30 countries. And most of these countries, the girls were about 5 years old. So here's a map of where this is prevalent in the world, entirely in Africa and parts of the Middle East. And it's very hard for me to get my head around this, but according to this statistical map, there are countries where this happens to 80% of the young girls. 80%. Egypt, Sudan, Somalia, Mali. This is Dr. Nawal Noor. I listened to a podcast where she was discussing this. She was born in Sudan, and she's a gynecologist at Harvard Medical School, and she also started the African Women's Health Center in Boston. And she's a MacArthur Grant recipient, which is amazing. So her specialty is treating women who have had female genital mutilation. And this is a little clip from a podcast that I listened to where she explains why some of these girls actually look forward to this and want this.
You have interacted, you said, with girls who were excited about FGM. What's that like to know everything you know, but then also see people who are excited to have this happen to them?
I mean, I understand it. It's a cultural practice that has persisted for centuries. And so girls have been taught at a very young age that this is something that they're going to look forward to. Yes, they're nervous, but yes, it's an important part of becoming a woman. In some of these cultures, a rite of passage is painful, but it is expected and normal. So I understand that girls can get excited about this because that's what they've been brought up believing is important for them to become a woman.
Is the mutilation of a young girl's clitoris for purposes of tradition or chastity acceptable? Right or wrong? Culturally relative. Male circumcision, and I don't want anybody saying that I'm just picking on other cultures, so my team takes a hit on this one. As you know, circumcision is a practice that all Jews and Muslims and many people in the world do, snipping off the foreskin of the baby's penis when he's only a few days old. This is tradition, and I think maybe back in the day it was about hygiene, but now it's really just about tradition. We're going to watch a debate with Christopher Hitchens and Rabbi Kushner. Christopher Hitchens was a reporter and commentator and hardcore atheist and one of my heroes. I used his quote in the front page of the syllabus: the essence of the independent mind lies not in what it thinks, but how it thinks. And he's just like a verbal Benihana chef. He just chops people up. The Rabbi Kushner, got very famous in the 80s. He wrote a huge book called When Bad Things Happen to Good People, after his son died of a degenerative disease, I think at the age of 10 or 11. So anyway, this is a debate about religion, the atheist versus the rabbi. And the rabbi thinks he's being cute by making a little joke, and Hitchens is not having it. So let's check it out.
Christopher, I've got to call you down on referring to circumcision as genital mutilation. My son cried more at his first haircut than he did at his bris. And statistically...
You weren't doing it right then.
Statistically, the only long-term effect that it seems to have on people is it increases their chances of winning a Nobel Prize.
I can't find the compulsory mutilation of the genitals of children a subject for humor in that way, or flippancy in that way. We have the records, I can show them to you, of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds in the United States of boy babies who've died or had life-threatening infections as a result of this disgusting practice. That a person as humane as yourself can sit here and think of that as a fit subject for humor shows what I mean. Religion makes morally normal people say and do disgusting and wicked things, and you've just proved my point for me. Shame on you for saying what you just said. Shame on you for saying it about your own son, my God.
Let's move on.
Yes, let's. What next? Cutting the labia of little girls. At least Judaism doesn't do that.
This is a question.
What if a Muslim was to say to you just now, my little girl cried more at her first haircut than when I cut off her clitoris? What would you think of me if I was to say such a disgusting thing?
Well,
remember, we are not talking about detail here. We're talking about whether religion makes people behave better or not.
let's give the rabbi a chance. I wanted to move on, but let's give the rabbi a chance to respond to what you said, because it got pretty personal here. So,
Again, my experience in my own son, my own grandson, hundreds of congregants, has been that it's nothing like what you're talking about.
Sure.
You know, I've lived through this personally, and
you've inflicted it, is what you're saying.
I've been what?
You've inflicted it or officiated at it, is what you're saying, isn't it?
Well, officiated, yes. Inflicted, no.
Is the cutting of an infant's penis foreskin acceptable? And finally, for the last question, now that we've seen all these different real examples, take a step back and think about it in the abstract. If you had to be in one camp or the other, what would it be?
Chuck, doesn't matter where you're from. Right is right and wrong is wrong. Doesn't matter where you're from.
I don't believe that.
And you know what? Let's give you a third option. Your third option is, I have no idea. I guess that's fair. You can say, I have no idea. That's legitimate. So I want to end today with my analysis. I tried to deliver all these examples as neutrally as possible. I don't know if it is possible, but I tried. But I wanted to take a moment and just tell you a couple of thoughts I had from all of this personally. I came up with these examples by just research, things I've known, things I specifically went out to try to learn about. And after I compiled the list, I realized what they all had in common was innocent and vulnerable people or creatures getting brutalized. So that's something to think about. As far as the female genital mutilation, I heard Christopher Hitchens say this idea that if you heard of one father who went and took a razor blade and cut off his 5-year-old daughter's clitoris, you would say that dude is evil, evil psycho, and should be in jail for the rest of his life and into the next life. But if millions of people do it, then we call it culture and it's okay. So that's heavy. As far as the male circumcision, if I ever have a child, I hope it's a girl so I don't have to make that decision. As far as eating dogs, you know, in India, they have reverence for the cow. They see the cow as a sacred creature, and that if you live a good life, and you're a good person, you can become reincarnated as a cow in the next life. Okay, 1 billion people in India believe this. And they would never eat a cow because it's like eating your grandmother or somebody else's grandmother. Now for us, dogs are like family members. They sleep in beds with people, and you know, dogs die and people are crushed. So you know, that's complicated. It's all complicated. As far as the Abu Ghraib and the albino hunting and the stoning people to death, it's just, it's horrible in every way possible. And to not say that it's horrible in every way possible, to not say that it's stupid and wrong, seems to me not just disingenuous, but dysfunctional. And I think what happens is when a lot of educated liberal people think that there's no foundation for human values, then everything is permissible and, you know, yeah, exactly. Just it leaves me speechless. On the flip side, of course, who's going to decide what these rules are? Which leads me to my final point. It's really useful to think of the yin-yang symbol in this dynamic between the duality of the absolute and the relative. Both positions have an internal contradiction which makes the whole thing basically absurd. For instance, the relativists say that everything is relative to the culture and we need to have tolerance to appreciate other cultures and their values. But what they're doing there is making tolerance be the absolute value that everyone needs to have in order to appreciate that everything is relative, right? On the flip side, the absolutist problem in their thinking is that they say there is truth, but they can't prove that it's true. And so how can something be true if it's not provable? So if it's not provable, it's not true, it's a belief. If you take both positions to their extreme, they actually become impossible. If everything is relative, then life is meaningless because you don't have to answer to anybody. The perfect example of that is Ted Bundy, who was a serial killer in Washington State in the 70s. I believe he killed 35 women. He was really smart and really charming, and he used his brains and his charm to not only meet women to kill them, but to not get caught for years and years, and then to justify all this. And here is his logic. This was an interview that he did in prison before he was executed. Then I learned that all moral judgments are value judgments, and that all value judgments are subjective, and that none can be proved to be either right or wrong. And I quickly discovered that the greatest obstacle to my freedom, the greatest block and limitation to it, consists in the insupportable value judgment that I was bound to respect the rights of others. I asked myself, who are these others? Other humans with human rights? Why is it more wrong to kill a human animal than any other animal, a pig or a sheep or a steer? Is your life more to you than a hog's life to a hog? Why should I be willing to sacrifice my pleasure more for one than the other? Surely you would not in this age of scientific enlightenment declare that God or nature has marked some pleasures as moral or good and others as immoral or bad. That is the honest conclusion to which my education has led me, after the most conscientious examination of my spontaneous and uninhibited self. And then on the absolutist side, if you take that position to an extreme, and we say, okay, there is a universal truth. One, who gets to decide what that universal truth is? For instance, I might say it's human flourishing, and this guy right here says, no, it's devotion to God and preparing for the next life. So even if we agree that there is such a thing as bedrock truth, we can't agree on what it is, let alone convince everybody else that they should believe it too. So that's why we're in this paradox that just spins around in circles over and over again for years and generations, and just going to keep spinning. So to conclude, I would like to leave you with this quote from Page Smith. Page Smith was the founder of Cowell College and really all of UC Santa Cruz, and the guy who brought Mary up from UCLA to teach that very first year in 1967 at UCSC. And this is from a book of his. He wrote, the English historian E.L. Woodward wrote, everything good has to be done over and over again, forever. That is to say that the good sustains the world. A million small acts of redemption must be performed every day simply to prevent us from sliding into the pit of greed and selfishness. The capacity to do good is, in essence, the only guarantee of a future world worth living in. So we will tally the results of the survey, and it'll be really interesting to see where you guys land on all of this. We'll continue this conversation in the debates, or not debates, discussions. They could be debates. And of course, if you have any questions, write me. And next time, we go into self-justification and cognitive dissonance.
Chuck, doesn't matter where you're from. Right is right and wrong is wrong. Doesn't matter where you're from.
I don't believe that.